There was a woman in Clover Ridge, Georgia, who never once asked for recognition. Her name was Della Watkins. She was 53 years old, 5'4" in her house slippers, and she had a front porch so wide that half the neighborhood had eaten at least one meal on it. She drove a 2009 Chevy Tahoe with 187,000 miles on it, and a crack in the windshield she kept meaning to fix. She worked as a dietary aide at Mercy Point Regional Medical Center, 5 days a week, 6 in the morning until 2:30 in the afternoon, and she had held that position for 14 years without complaint. She made $18.75 an hour. She knew the name of every patient on the 3rd floor by the end of their first day. She brought extra cornbread when the weather got cold, because she said cold weather made people miss home. And nobody should be missing home in a hospital bed without something warm to eat. She owned a 3-bedroom house on Caldwell Street that her mother had left her, and in that house she had raised her own daughter, Priya, who was now 28 and working as a speech therapist in Nashville. Priya called every Sunday at 7. Those were Della's favorite hours of the week, those phone calls. She would pour a glass of sweet tea, sit in the armchair near the window, and let her daughter's voice fill the room like good music. But Priya was in Nashville, and Caldwell Street was quiet. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when everything that would change Della's life and the lives of 3 boys she had not yet met quietly began to move into place. Before we go any further, I want to know something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments. I'm always curious to see how far these stories reach. Della was at work, wheeling her breakfast cart down the 3rd floor hallway at Mercy Point, when she passed room 318 and noticed it was quiet in a way that felt wrong. There was a 7-year-old in that room named Marcus, who, in the 4 days since his admission for a severe asthma attack, had made enough noise to qualify as a one-man band. He hummed constantly. He kicked the bed rail. He asked the nursing staff approximately 40 questions per shift. But that morning, room 318 was silent. Della set the brake on her cart and knocked on the open door with 2 knuckles. "You sleeping in there, Marcus?" No answer. She pushed the door open and found the boy sitting upright in his bed with his knees pulled to his chest and his eyes fixed on the window. He was not looking at anything specific. He was looking at the kind of nothing that settles over a child when the weight of their situation has finally arrived. Della stepped inside. She set a bowl of oatmeal on his tray table. She sat in the chair beside the bed and said nothing for almost a full minute, which was a skill that did not come naturally to her, but that she had spent years practicing, because she had learned that silence, offered at the right moment, says more than any word. Finally, Marcus said, "She's not coming." Della looked at the chair near the window where a visitor's coat had hung on the 2nd day. It was gone now. "Who's not coming, baby?" "My grandma. The nurses said she called." He paused. "She said she's got my brothers to look after." "You got brothers?" He held up 2 fingers. "DeShawn is 9. Caleb is 5. He was quiet for a moment. "They're at the house." The house, Della would learn over the next 20 minutes, was a rental on Birch Avenue, 3 miles from Mercy Point, where Marcus, DeShawn, and Caleb had been living with their paternal grandmother, Patricia, for the past 8 months. Their mother, a woman named Rhonda, had checked into a rehab facility in Macon in February. Their father had not been in the picture for 3 years. Patricia was 69 and had a heart condition and 2 bad knees, and she was managing 3 grandsons on $1,140 a month in Social Security and a prayer. She had called the hospital that morning not to explain her absence, but to ask if there was any chance Marcus could stay an extra day. She needed the time. Della went back to her cart. She finished her rounds. She clocked out at 2:30. She drove to the address on Birch Avenue that she had looked up in Marcus's chart under emergency contact, which she was not technically supposed to do, and she sat in front of the house for 4 minutes, deciding whether to knock on the door. She knocked. Patricia answered in a house dress and slippers, with the look of a woman who had been dealing with too much for too long and had stopped being surprised by any of it. She studied Della for a moment, this stranger on her porch, and said, "Who are you?" "My name is Della Watkins. I work at Mercy Point. I've been bringing Marcus his meals." She held up a Tupperware container. "I made too much pot roast." Patricia looked at the Tupperware for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider. In the kitchen, 5-year-old Caleb was sitting on the floor with a box of crackers, and 9-year-old DeShawn was at the table doing homework with a pencil so short it barely fit between his fingers. Both boys looked up when Della walked in. Neither of them spoke. They had learned, over the past 8 months, to be cautious around adults who came through the door. Della set the pot roast on the counter. She said, "Anybody want some cornbread? I've got some in the car." DeShawn looked at his grandmother. His grandmother gave one small nod. And that was how it began. "Now that you know who Della is, I have to ask you something. Have you ever met someone like her? Someone who saw a need that had nothing to do with her and walked toward it anyway? Tell me about that person in the comments." Marcus came home from Mercy Point on a Thursday. Della had already been to the house twice more by then, once with the cornbread she had promised, once with a bag of groceries that she said she had bought too many of. Patricia had not asked her to come. Della had not asked permission. She had simply shown up, the way some people do, the way the people who save you always seem to do it. Not with speeches or announcements, but with a quiet, steady presence that one day you realize you have started to depend on. The first weeks were informal. Della would stop by on her way home from Mercy Point and sit with the boys while Patricia rested. Or she helped DeShawn with his long division. She taught Caleb how to tie his shoes using the bunny ear method, then the loop swoop method. Then back to bunny ears, because Caleb insisted the bunny ears were more fun. She took Marcus to his follow-up appointment at the pediatric pulmonology clinic on Greer Street and sat with him in the waiting room while he asked her 40 questions, which was the number of questions Marcus asked when he was feeling like himself again. Patricia watched all of this with the careful, measuring eyes of a woman who had seen too many promises made and broken to celebrate anything too soon. But by the 6th week, when Della arrived on a Tuesday to find all 3 boys sick with a stomach bug and Patricia sitting in the kitchen looking like she might cry from exhaustion, Patricia said, "I don't know how much longer I can do this." It was not a complaint. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact delivered by a woman who had been holding a wall up with her bare hands and was starting to lose feeling in her arms. Della drove all 3 boys to her house on Caldwell Street that night. She called it a sleepover. She told them they could pick whatever movie they wanted as long as it did not have the word battle in the title, because she was not watching anything with that many explosions at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday. They picked a nature documentary about penguins. Caleb fell asleep in 20 minutes. DeShawn watched the whole thing with the focus of a boy who had been hungry for exactly this kind of quiet all his life. That was November. By December, the boys were spending 4 nights a week at Della's house on Caldwell Street. By January, it was 5 nights. Patricia had been hospitalized twice, once for an arrhythmia, once for a fall in the bathroom. And each time, the boys came to Caldwell Street as a matter of course, the way water finds its level. They knew where the cereal was. They knew that Della kept extra toothbrushes in the second drawer under the bathroom sink. They knew that she would not tolerate meanness at the dinner table, and that she would give you a second piece of pie if you asked politely. In February, Rhonda completed her program in Macon and returned to Clover Ridge with clear eyes and a 60-day chip and the best of intentions. She took her boys home to Birch Avenue. It lasted 11 weeks. In April, she relapsed. The boys ended up back with Patricia, though Patricia was now on a walker. In May, Clover Ridge's Division of Child and Family Services opened a formal case. The caseworker assigned to the boys was a woman named Teresa Pringle, 31 years old, with a caseload of 47 families and the perpetually overwhelmed energy of someone who genuinely cared but had too little time to show it. She met with Patricia. She met with Rhonda. She visited Birch Avenue and documented the conditions, which were not dangerous but were not thriving. She wrote in her report that the children were physically safe, but that their stability was fragile and that their emotional well-being had been significantly impacted by inconsistency in caregiving. Moss, on her third visit to Caldwell Street, which Pringle had noted in the file as an informal support residence, she sat across from Della at the kitchen table and said, "Ms. Watkins, are you familiar with the concept of kinship care?" Della said, "I know what foster care is. I don't know that I'm kin to these boys." Pringle said, "The law in Georgia is broader than biological connection. You are a consistent, stable caregiver. The children are attached to you. You have adequate housing and income and no history with DFCS." She paused. "If you were interested in becoming their licensed foster parent, the division would be very supportive of that." Della sat with that for a long time. She thought about Priya, who had her own life in Nashville and who, when Della called her that Sunday, said, "Mom, but you've basically already done it." She thought about her Chevy Tahoe with 187,000 miles on it and the cracked windshield, and whether she had any business putting 3 growing boys in that vehicle. She thought about Marcus, who kept his inhaler in the front pocket of his backpack, and who still knocked on her bedroom door sometimes at 2 a.m. just to make sure she was there. She thought about DeShawn, who had gotten a 96 on his last math test, and who had handed her the paper with the expression of someone who had been waiting his whole life for a reason to feel proud of himself, and wasn't sure the feeling was allowed. She thought about Caleb, who called her Miss Della, and who still climbed into her lap sometimes even though he was 6 now and nearly too big for it, because some children spend so long without a lap to climb into that, when they find one they have to make up for lost time. She signed the paperwork in June. The licensing process took 4 months. Della completed 80 hours of pre-service training through the Clover Ridge DFCS office on Pecan Boulevard. She attended classes on childhood trauma, attachment disorders, and the specific impacts of prenatal substance exposure, which Caleb's early records suggested might be a factor in some of his developmental delays. She purchased bunk beds for the 2nd bedroom and a trundle for the 3rd. She had her home inspected twice. She paid $340 to have a carbon monoxide detector system installed throughout the house because the inspector said her existing setup was adequate, but Della did not do adequate. She became a licensed foster parent on October 14th, almost exactly 1 year to the day after she had knocked on a door on Birch Avenue with a Tupperware container of pot roast. Marcus, DeShawn, and Caleb moved into Caldwell Street officially on October 19th. They brought 4 trash bags of belongings and a laundry basket with a broken handle. DeShawn brought a folder of school papers that he had kept since the 3rd grade. Marcus brought his rescue inhaler and a stuffed elephant named Gerald that he was 9 now and nominally too old for, but that Della never once mentioned. Caleb brought a drawing he had made of the 3 of them, and Della standing in front of a yellow house. The house on Caldwell Street was beige, but Caleb had drawn it yellow, because that was the color it felt like to him. And Della put the drawing in a frame and hung it in the hallway where everyone could see it. What Teresa Pringle did next, recording in that file that Della was the most stabilizing adult figure in the boys' lives since before they could properly remember, set something in motion that nobody at DFCS could have predicted. But before we get there, I need you to tell me something. After everything that system put those boys through, the hospitals, the moves, the back and forth, What would you have done if you were Della sitting at that kitchen table? Would you have signed those papers? Let me know in the comments. The years that followed were not easy in the way that people who haven't raised children sometimes imagine they might be. They were not a Hallmark movie. But they were Tuesday mornings when Caleb had a meltdown before school because his shirt tag scratched him, and it took 40 minutes and every ounce of Della's patience to get him dressed. They were parent-teacher conferences, where DeShawn's 7th grade English teacher said he was bright but unmotivated, and Della sat in that plastic chair with her hands folded in her lap and said, "Tell me what motivated looks like to you, and I'll figure out how to get him there," and held the teacher's eyes until the teacher understood that this conversation was going to require actual substance. They were the phone calls from Rhonda, who called every few months in the early years, sometimes coherent and sometimes not. Della always picked up. She never spoke badly about Rhonda to the boys. When Marcus, at 11, asked why his mom hadn't called in 3 months, Della said, "Your mom is fighting something hard. Fighting hard things takes a lot of a person. It doesn't mean she doesn't love you." She paused. "It means the fight is bigger than the phone right now." Marcus looked at her for a long moment and then went back to his homework, and Della sat very still at the kitchen table because she needed a moment to make sure her face did not show the grief she felt on his behalf. They were Friday nights that became the best nights of the week. Pizza on the coffee table, whatever movie was on, Caleb falling asleep in the armchair every single time. DeShawn always pretending he had not wanted to watch the movie anyway, and then watching the whole thing. They were Sunday dinners that Priya started making the trip down from Nashville for at least once a month, because she had, without making a formal announcement about it, adopted 3 brothers. They were the years when Della drove that Chevy Tahoe with 187,000 miles on it to every single school event, every doctor's appointment, every dentist visit, every soccer game that DeShawn convinced himself he didn't care about playing in, and then played in as if his life depended on it. She replaced the windshield in the 2nd year because Marcus started sitting in the front seat, and she did not want him looking at the world through a crack. She made $18.75 an hour at Mercy Point until 2021, when the hospital did a across-the-board wage adjustment for dietary staff, and she went to $21.40. She drove a 2019 Chevy Tahoe now, and bought used from a dealership on Route 9, with a down payment she had saved over 3 years by making almost every meal at home and buying clothes at the Goodwill on Maple Street, which she called the Boutique, and which she maintained had better selection than the Macy's at Clover Ridge Mall, and she would debate anyone on that point. The boys grew. DeShawn was the one Della had always known would surprise everyone, not because he was secretly extraordinary, though she believed he was, but because he had so thoroughly convinced the adults around him that he was ordinary. He had done it deliberately, she understood in hindsight. He had spent too many years in situations where being noticed meant being disrupted. Staying invisible had been a survival strategy. Caldwell Street was the first place where visibility had ever felt safe. By high school, the invisible DeShawn had become the DeShawn who stayed after his AP chemistry class to ask Dr. Pittman questions that Dr. Pittman had to look up before the next day. The DeShawn who, at 16, started tutoring other students at the Clover Ridge Public Library on Saturdays, not because anyone asked him to, but because Marcus had struggled with algebra in 7th grade, and DeShawn had spent 3 weekends teaching him and discovered that teaching was something that lit him up from the inside out. He started a study group that eventually had 11 members. He called it, with perfect sincerity and zero irony, the Saturday Scholars. Marcus was the one who worried Della the most and, in worrying her, made her a better parent. His asthma was manageable, but not gone. He missed school 14 days in 7th grade. But he was stubborn in the way that children who have experienced loss tend to be stubborn, not defiantly, but carefully, holding the things he cared about so tightly that bending them felt like breaking. He cared about his brothers with a protectiveness that went beyond his years. He cared about basketball with a devotion that Della chose to feed rather than redirect, because she had learned that a child with a passion is a child with an anchor. She drove him to Clover Ridge Community Basketball League practices 3 times a week for 4 years. In his junior year at Clover Ridge High School, Marcus was named captain of the varsity basketball team. He was also, at that point, carrying a 3.6 GPA, which he had spent 2 years building from a 2.8 through sheer grinding effort that Della had watched up close and that had made her cry, and alone in the kitchen at midnight more than once. Not from worry, from awe. Caleb was the youngest, and the one who had come to Della most tenderly damaged and would leave her most transformed by love. His developmental delays had required speech therapy until he was 10, occupational therapy until he was 12, and the particular therapy of being seen, truly seen, which Della administered every single day without a clinical title for it. By the time Caleb was in high school, he was the boy who remembered every teacher's birthday, who stopped to talk to the custodial staff the way other students walked past them, who drew constantly, comics, portraits, landscapes, in sketchbooks that Della bought for him at the art supply store on Elm Street 3 at a time because he filled them quickly. He got into the graphic design program at Clover Ridge Community College at 18 and showed Della the acceptance letter with both hands, shaking slightly, as if he couldn't quite believe the document was real. Della took a picture of him holding that letter. She put it next to the yellow house, drawing in the hallway. Patricia passed away in the winter of DeShawn's senior year of high school. She had lived just long enough to see her grandson settle into something that looked, from the outside, like peace. Della drove the boys to the funeral at Greater Shiloh Baptist Church on Decatur Avenue. She sat in the pew behind them and watched them hold each other. These 3 young men who had been held together mostly by love and stubbornness and the stubborn insistence of one woman that they were worth showing up for. She did not cry in the church. She cried in the Chevy Tahoe in the parking lot afterward, for a long time, for Patricia, and for everything Patricia had carried, and for the part of the boy's story that would always have pain in it no matter what happened next. We are getting very close to the moment when everything Della poured into these 3 boys comes back to her. And I mean that in a way that will surprise you. Before I tell you what happened, what do you think happened? Drop your prediction in the comments right now. What do you think 3 boys who were raised like this would do? DeShawn Watkins, because he had taken Della's name during the adoption finalization, which had happened quietly in a Clover Ridge family courtroom on a Wednesday afternoon in the summer before his 8th grade year. Or as all 3 boys in new shirts that Della had pressed the night before, graduated from Harrington University in Atlanta with a degree in biochemistry in May of 2024. He graduated summa cum laude. He had a 3.94 GPA. He had been accepted into the MD/PhD program at Callaway School of Medicine in Atlanta, which was one of 14 medical schools in the country to offer the combined degree, and which had an acceptance rate of 3.2%. His scholarship covered full tuition. His research stipend was $32,000 a year. Della drove to Atlanta in the Chevy Tahoe, which now had 94,000 miles on it because it was a different Chevy Tahoe, the 3rd one, bought 3 years ago with cash. Because Della Watkins had spent 20 years doing one thing at a time and doing it right. She sat in the Harrington University commencement ceremony in a dress that Priya had helped her pick out, a deep plum that Priya said matched the color of authority, and she watched her son walk across that stage. She had placed his name card in her purse the night before, so that she would have something to hold during the ceremony, and when they called his name, DeShawn Marcus Watkins, she held the card with both hands and did not try to stop herself from crying, because some things earn every tear they produce. She stood up in the bleachers and cheered with her whole voice, and the people around her cheered too, some of them not knowing who she was or why she was crying, just responding to the frequency of her joy, the way people do when they are near something real. Marcus graduated from Clover Ridge State University the following December with a degree in sports management. He had spent 2 years playing on the CCSU basketball team before a shoulder injury ended his playing career at 20, and he had responded to that particular loss the way Della had raised him to respond to loss, by standing back up and finding the next thing. He became the team's assistant athletic coordinator in his junior year. He was offered a full-time position before he finished his degree. He had, characteristically, waited until graduation to accept it, because he wanted to finish what he started. Caleb transferred from Clover Ridge Community College to the graphic design program at Millbrook College of Art in Savannah at 20 on a partial scholarship. His portfolio, which he had sent to 12 schools, had been described by the admissions committee at Millbrook as among the most emotionally resonant work they had seen from an undergraduate applicant. Caleb, when Della told him this, said, "I just draw what I feel." Della said, "Then you must have a lot to say." He looked at her for a moment, and then nodded, very seriously, like a person agreeing with a true thing. In the fall of 2025, Caleb Watkins, 22 years old, 2 years out of Millbrook with a degree and a growing client list, was commissioned to create a mural for the new community health center being built in downtown Clover Ridge. The Clover Ridge Community Health Center was a $4.7 million facility funded through a combination of state grants and private donors, and the kind of sustained community advocacy that takes years and leaves calluses on your hands. It was being built on the corner of Decatur Avenue and 5th Street, 4 blocks from Mercy Point Regional Medical Center, and it was designed to serve the uninsured and underinsured residents of Clover Ridge's east side. The families, as the project director had said at the groundbreaking, who had been falling through the cracks for a generation. Caleb painted the mural on the east-facing wall. It was 40 feet wide and 22 feet tall. It depicted a woman in a warm kitchen, her arms open, and 3 boys coming through the door. The light in the painting was amber and gold. The kitchen was painted yellow. He did not put Della's face on the woman in the painting, because he had asked her permission, and she had said she didn't need her face on a wall. But he put her hands on the woman. That's because Della had the hands of someone who had spent 30 years taking care of people, and hands, Caleb said, told the truth, even when faces were polite. He put the yellow house in the background. He titled the mural Caldwell Street. The unveiling was held on a Saturday morning in October, which meant it was exactly 7 years after Della had signed her foster care paperwork, and 4 years after the adoption had been finalized, and 26 years after Della had taken the dietary aide position at Mercy Point, and decided she would be the person who brought extra cornbread when the weather got cold. The mayor of Clover Ridge was there. The project director was there. A reporter from the Clover Ridge Gazette was there. Several hundred people were there. Would gathered on the corner of Decatur and 5th on a cool October morning, with the kind of light that makes everything look like a memory in progress. Della stood in the front row. She was wearing the plum dress again, because Priya said it was an authority dress, and today felt like it called for authority. She stood between Priya and Marcus, who had his arm around her shoulders, and DeShawn, who was standing to her left with his hands in his pockets, in the particular way that meant he was trying not to show how emotional he was, and Caleb, who was standing slightly apart with his arms crossed and his jaw tight and his eyes wet, the way artists stand when their work is about to be seen by the world for the first time. When the covering came down, the crowd went quiet for a moment, on the kind of quiet that happens when something true enters a room. Then they started to applaud. Della looked at the mural for a long time. She looked at the yellow kitchen, and the amber light, and the open arms, and the 3 boys coming through the door, and the hands, her real hands, rendered in oil and acrylic on a wall 40 feet wide. And something happened in her chest that she did not have a precise word for. It was not pride exactly, though it was partly pride. It was not relief, though there was something of relief in it. It was the feeling of watching something you gave away come back transformed into something larger than you ever imagined. The feeling of standing at the end of a long story and realizing that the part you played in the beginning was the part that made all the rest of it possible. Only a microphone was being passed through the crowd. Someone was calling for remarks. The project director said something gracious and long. The mayor said something shorter and almost as gracious. Then DeShawn took the microphone. He stood at 24 years old, 6 feet tall, in the first good coat he had ever owned. A charcoal wool overcoat he had bought on his first stipend check, because one of the things Della had taught him was that you dressed for where you were going, not where you had been. And he said, "I want to say something about the person this mural is really about." The crowd shifted. Della felt Marcus's arm tighten around her shoulders. DeShawn said, "When I was 9 years old, I was at a kitchen table on Birch Avenue with a pencil too short to write with, and a woman I had never met came through the door with pot roast. I didn't know what she was doing there. I didn't know she was about to change everything." He paused. He looked at Della. "I know now." He said, "She never asked to be recognized. She never told anyone what she was doing or why. She just showed up. And then she kept showing up. And then she showed up again. And she made our house feel like a home before it was legally our home. And she made us feel like her sons before it was legally official. And she did all of it on a dietary aide salary and a used Chevy Tahoe, and the belief that we were worth it." His voice broke on that last word. He stopped. He pressed his lips together. He continued, "We were her boys before the paperwork. The paperwork just caught up." The applause started before he finished. It rose and kept rising. Della had her hand over her mouth. Marcus said quietly in her ear, "You don't have to hold it together, Mom." She didn't. Della's crown was finally recognized on that corner on a Saturday morning in October, in front of a wall 40 feet wide that her youngest son had painted in amber and gold. And I want to know, have you ever had a moment like that? A moment when someone finally saw what you had been pouring out quietly for years? Share your story in the comments. Someone watching right now needs to hear it. What followed the unveiling was the kind of afternoon that anchors itself permanently in a person's memory. The Clover Ridge Gazette ran a front-page story the following Monday with a photograph of Della and the 3 boys standing in front of the mural, where the headline read, "A Caldwell Street Story, How One Foster Mother Changed the Lives of 3 Clover Ridge Boys and Why They Came Back to Say So." The story was picked up by 2 regional news outlets, then by a statewide media aggregator based in Atlanta. Within 4 days, it had been shared 14,000 times on Facebook and generated several hundred comments, most of them from people who said they had someone like Della in their own story. An aunt, a grandmother, a teacher, a neighbor, someone who had shown up with food and stayed. Della read some of the comments and then put the phone down and went to make dinner, because that was what she did. DeShawn sent the article to his department chair at Callaway School of Medicine. On not to show off, that was not DeShawn, but because his research focus was on health disparities in low-income communities, and the new Clover Ridge Community Health Center was going to serve exactly the population he had oriented his entire academic career toward. His department chair forwarded the article to the Dean of Community Partnerships, who called DeShawn the following week to to ask if he would consider joining the center's inaugural advisory board. DeShawn was 24 years old and still in his first year of his MD/PhD program. He said yes. Marcus, for his part, used the attention around the mural to do something he had been thinking about for 2 years. That he approached the director of the Clover Ridge Parks and Recreation Department with a proposal for a community basketball program specifically targeted at foster youth in the county. The proposal was 8 pages long. He had written it over 3 weekends at the kitchen table on Caldwell Street, where Della had continued to feed him dinner every Sunday, even though he had his own apartment now, because some things did not stop just because the paperwork said you were grown. The Parks and Recreation Director approved the program in January. Marcus named it the Caldwell Street League. The first session had 31 kids. By spring, the waiting list had 42 more. Caleb was commissioned for 2 more murals before the end of the year. He opened a small studio on Elm Street with a friend from Millbrook. He was the artist in residence at Clover Ridge Elementary School every Tuesday and Thursday, teaching kids to draw what they felt, because someone had once told him that was the only thing worth drawing, and he had decided the least he could do was pass it forward. Della still worked at Mercy Point. She had been promoted in 2023 to lead dietary coordinator, which paid $27.80 an hour and involved managing a team of 11 and coordinating menus for 3 floors. She still brought extra cornbread when the weather got cold. She still knew every patient on the 3rd floor by name. She did add one thing to her routine, beginning in November of 2025. Every Tuesday, she stopped by the Clover Ridge Community Health Center on Decatur Avenue on her way home from work. Not because she was needed there, because Caleb's mural was on the east wall, and on certain Tuesday afternoons, when the light was right, coming in low from the west, bouncing off the building across the street and catching the gold in the painting, those amber-lit arms glowed in a way that stopped people on the sidewalk. She would stand there for a few minutes and look at the yellow kitchen and the 3 boys coming through the door and her own hands, open and reaching. Then she would get in the Chevy Tahoe and drive home to Caldwell Street. The porch light was always on. If you have made it this far, then you already know what this story is really about. It is about the people who give without keeping score, who show up without being asked, who pour themselves into the lives of others so quietly and completely that the world forgets to notice. Until one day, on a street corner, on a Saturday morning in October, with amber light catching a 40-foot wall, the world remembers. Della Watkins never asked to be seen, but she raised 3 sons who made sure she was. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Crowned Stories so you never miss the next one. Every week, we bring you the people the world overlooked and the unforgettable moments when their crowns were finally claimed. Hit that bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if Della's story reminded you of someone in your own life, tell them. Don't wait for the mural.